looking back, this is an important moment in the history of the United States, because before the intellectual ideas of Europe arrived in America, and by intellectual ideas, I do mean things like socialism, and full like European socialism or Marxism. There had always been an attempt to create utopian communes. You go back to New Harmony or Brook Farm or heck, the Pilgrims, right? So one of the beliefs that strong Christians had throughout much of history is to try to create a heavenly sort of reflection here on earth. Not that you can make heaven be on earth, but to try to create the kingdom of heaven, quote unquote. And so that would then lead to life being better for everyone, right? So these were in many ways like early socialists, but they weren't socialists as in Marxist socialists. So they were arguing that the role of the state is to care for the less fortunate. The role of society was to take care of the less fortunate, thus the word social. And then their prism was through Christianity. That was that lens. So these are sometimes called, in later history, Christian socialists, okay? They were not advocating for what we think of today as socialism. They weren't saying the government should control every major means of production and stuff like that. But they did believe the government had a role in helping particularly the poor and downtrodden. Now, primarily at this point in history, the government had very little role. Remember, the only role they had really were like urban machines. So like Boss Tweed would sort of take care of immigrants for his own purposes. But when we get to this period, you start to see not only sort of Christian socialists, but also Christian groups who believe that the church has swayed too far away from its core Christian values and has become materialistic. So like, for example, today, there are intense fundamentalists who utterly reject the gospel of wealth. You understand? They're intense fundamentalists who believe that God said, you're going to suffer in my name, right? You're like, life should be suffering if you're a good Christian, they argue, right? So fundamentalist approach is going to be to reject greed and materialism, right? It doesn't hurt that a lot of times they're really poor people. It's much easier to reject greed and materialism if you don't have any. Right? But into this vacuum in the cities steps one of the most influential urban pastors of all time. And today there are several major religious education centers named for this man. This is D.L. Moody. D.L. Moody was an urban city revivalist. He would give, instead of the big tent meetings in the countryside, he would go into these enormous theaters and give massive revivals. And he argued that this materialist approach was really missing, the point of Christianity. The point of Christianity is not to get rich or die trying, but rather to the Sermon on the Mount and to care for the less fortunate. And so his positivity idea of really making the world a better place, a kingdom of heaven, is going to take off, and particularly amongst the poor, as you might imagine. So in other words, you can be blessed by God living in a city and not, a giant industrialist. So downplays the role of materialism. The Third Great Awakening was saying that the city has kind of lost its Christian flavor, right? Not that it ever really had much of it, but in other words, Christianity wasn't doing well in the cities. Cities offer all these other, vices, so to speak. So here he's preaching to the urban poor and saying, look, the role of Christ is to, besides salvation, obviously, is to improve the life of your brothers, lift up your name. Number two commandment, right? Number one commandment, both social gospel and, these guys talk about is Jesus's commandment is to love God, right? Number one. And then number two is to love your neighbor, right? Number two commandment. So these guys are going to really talk about it. And you're going to first time really see the role of the Catholic Church play an actual noted role beyond simply within the archbishoprics or bishoprics in which they occur. Now, obviously, the Catholic Church is important in New York and in Boston, right? But here in Richmond, you're going to have our first major bishop, who will then be elevated to the Archbishopric of Baltimore, and then to be a cardinal. So a cardinal is, besides the red bird, is the leader right below the Pope in the Catholic hierarchy. And by this period, by the Gilded Age, the largest single denomination, I have to explain to people how this works. Like, Catholics are Christians, for my Protestants who don't know any better. All right. But more importantly, they're the largest denomination in America. So there are more Catholics than Baptists, more Catholics than Methodists. And they grow in significance in their significance. And so this cardinal is going to preach and work with the government. He's going to advise presidents, and he is going to freely associate himself with organized labor. So this is the beginning of when the Catholic Church and labor unions sort of work together. So one of the great ironies, I guess, of America is that we think of like the Christian vote as a monolith. You guys understand what that means? A monolith, like one size fits all. But Joe Biden is a Catholic. He practiced Ash Wednesday, and it's Lent, right now. So in other words, there are lots of Christians whose voting pattern and political affiliation is deeply embedded in the tradition of things like the Catholic Church being a part of the working class people. So the Catholic Church routinely, in modern terms, has come to conflict with the Democratic Party, primarily over social value issues of abortion, gay marriage, things like that. But historically, the Catholic Church is very much aligned with sort of working class people on labor rights and the rights of workers to organize. And so kind of think of them as like that version of liberal, okay? Not liberal in terms of social issues like modern social issues, but nonetheless, Cardinal Gibbons, I'd be familiar with him. Okay, now one of the most interesting things about this sort of third Great Awakening is the emergence of several new, deeply influential religious movements in America. Now, much of this comes out of a group of thinkers called the New Thought movement. Now, when I call it New Thought, it's not my term, it's a term that they used. But what they're saying is that they're looking at God as sort of this omniscient intelligence, this sort of broad intelligence, but that divinity is within us all, right? Like, in other words, we're God's greatest creation. And so they're very much associated with the power of positivity. You guys ever heard that phrase, power of positivity? And so they're one of their core beliefs, and it's very interesting to me, is that I've been watching videos on it, is it's from the ideas of the faith healing movement, okay? The power of prayer. And so what you're going to see is emerging out of that. Now, she's not the first person to advocate that spirituality equates to health, all right? But her name is Mary Baker Eddy, and she is going to, she's initially the sort of student. So the very first person to promote this really in American history was a Frenchman named Mesmer, M-E-S-M-E-R. Have you guys ever heard of mesmerize? So it's a form of hypnotism. And so what they discovered is that under hypnosis, they could cure stuff. And they began preaching that really sickness is in your head. Like, in other words, it's a creation of your body from your mind. And so the Christian Scientist, that's what we call this, the Church of Christ Scientists, or Christian Science. It's a great little video I have on her on the YouTube video. But she was one of the most famous people in the entire country, and she founds this religion. She starts a brand new Christian religion based on the idea that, well, like I said, that you could think positively and that would lead to healing. So what she does is the Church of Christ Scientists, or the Christian Scientists, reject medicines. They don't take medicines, for example, surgery, things like that. And so they're much more healing based on faith, healing based on prayer. And so the Christian Scientist Church is still a very large church around the world, not just in America. And so one of the great churches of American history is started during this period by Miss Eddy, Mary Baker Eddy. Here you can see a cartoon where Mark Twain is asking for a copy of her beautiful book. All right. And so very, very influential lady. Millions of people were following the teachings of this group of people, this higher thought or new thought, okay, which is sort of metaphysical. I kind of think of it in some ways connected to transcendentalism, except there's a Christian element attached. You understand? In other words, the God of the transcendentalists is God in heaven. So it's like an Eastern thing. So long before Buddhism really took hold in America, these people believed in meditation and healthy living like that. So it's very sort of new agey. In fact, it was called New Thought, in a period that we don't think of as really being that likely. Another church, a couple more churches emerged during this period. One came over from England, and it was called the Salvation Army. It was an organized church, a formal church. Probably heard of the Salvation Army. Another was the Y movement, which is 150 years old. The Y movement, which is the YMCA and the YWCA, the Young Women's and Young Men's Christian Association. You have these new churches that are designed to outreach to the poor and to the urban populations and to not your traditional ways of looking at religious beliefs, right? All of those still exist today in America as part of our diverse religious beliefs. So I would definitely be familiar with the Y. Salvation Army comes out of England, but very much becomes a part of the United States. And probably most noteworthy of the time, Christian Science. Now, she has multiple publications. One of her publications is secular as a news source to counteract the garbage news of that day. So she actually creates a news magazine, which is still in circulation today. It's called the Christian Science Monitor. And Christian Science Monitor is a secular magazine. It's like Time or Newsweek, except it was created to counteract William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer's sensationalism. They wanted to make decent news, not garbage news, so to speak. So that's another element of the Christian Science church. So no new thought, all right? Now, what emerges during this period, and it's not going to reach its zenith until the 1920s, but what happens is the publication of On the Origin of Species. So Darwin's book comes out in right around the Civil War. Okay, so it doesn't make a big splash initially, but pretty soon as it begins to be read, the book particularly, and taught on college campuses, the word starts to get out. And it's not so much his book on the origin of species as it is his book, The Descent of Man, which is the one where he posits the thesis that humans are somewhere descendants of primates, right? So most scientists are very quick to accept the premise of natural selection. Once you use natural selection, you start to understand, multiple variations in organic beings, right? But the one about the descent of man is is considered by many to be utterly sacrilegious. Keep in mind, if you read the Bible, this fundamentally contradicts what Darwin wrote. So what you had was a debate that emerged amongst educated Christians about well what should we do? Because the Bible says one thing and Darwin's science seems pretty solid. So what we call Christians who believe that the Bible is symbolic or is representative of a dream, an idea, a goal, a belief, some sort of metaphor, that then they can say, well, the story of creation is just that, a story. To kind of paraphrase what Galileo said, the Bible's here to tell you how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go, right? So, what Darwin was a Christian. Darwin was not trying to disrupt Christianity around the world. But at the same time, the scientists began arguing that, this is how it works, right? And so Christian, particularly in the more rural parts of our country, like here and others, began to utterly become defensive of the Bible. And they argue that nothing in the Bible is wrong. That the Bible is God's fundamental word. It's his truth. And that anyone who is skeptical of that is sacrilegious or heretic or whatever you want to call the word. And so they began to push for example, particularly in what we now call the Bible Belt. So we're in the buckle of the Bible Belt. Danville is called the City of Churches, one of the most fundamental group of Christian people in our country. We live right here. So the fundamentalists will be in Virginia, in Tennessee, where they're going to pass something called the Butler Act, which is going to prohibit the teaching of evolution in science classes. In Georgia. And so in other words, the rural South, once word of this gets out, there's going to be a real attempt to stop the teaching of evolution, particularly to high school students or to students in general. They definitely don't want that. Now, as I said, this is going to become a sort of much more controversial issue by the 1920s once these laws are passed. But early on, the debate is really amongst Christians who are concerned that Darwin's teachings violate the tenets of the Bible. And so a fundamentalist is someone who reads the Bible and says this, you might translate fundamentalist in parentheses as like literalist. Like the Bible is to be read literally. A modernist is a Christian who believes that the Bible is symbolic at times. It has metaphors, it has interpretation. Both of which are Christian groups, both of which still exist in the United States today. Now keep in mind, this does no way reflect views of like agnostics, like Robert Ingersoll, who was one of the most famous men in America at the time. So you have other people who are atheists who are like, they're not, they believe in evolution, but not in creation. So you have an interesting debate going on in our country, sort of intellectually first. And Darwin certainly expected that when he wrote his book. He knew that there would be a controversy, but he's a scientist. He's not trying to overwhelm what he had been taught in church. Now, one of the things the book points out is that pretty much the idea of organic evolution takes hold in college campuses by the 20th century. So it's the idea that, and if you ever wonder, like, where did colleges become known as a sort of liberal bastion? This is where it starts. So in science, where they're teaching you something that is controversial and refutes the Bible, then clearly not good people, right? If you're a fundamentalist. So this is the beginning of that, and really people are going to fight over that to this day. It's still a heated debate in some quarters. Okay, now moving on, let's focus more on this next question. Why did America become such an educated society, like so quickly? Like we went from being a non-educated society 50 years before. I mean, 50 years. You go back to 1820, not education. 1870s, huge education. Well, what happens? In this 50-year period. So let's make sure you have it. First of all, states begin passing laws that require students to go to school. This is called compulsory attendance. The growth of high schools, particularly in the North. Now, I'll remind you, my granddaddy from Alabama left school after the age of 13. Okay, that was completely legal and normal. But that's because it was also hard to find a high school. A high school like what you attend would have been fairly rare 150 years ago. So the rise in high school education. Free obviously means tax paid. Nothing's free in this world, but these books were tax supported. So when I went to Virginia Tech for education, they didn't call it a normal school. But when my mama went to Madison College, it was a normal school more. So it was primarily its single purpose was to train teachers. JMU today. Today, education has become a much more, the teaching profession, a much more respected profession. For most of history, it was women's work that was paid very menially. Students used to pay their teacher every day. That was how you got paid. So the rise of all types of new schools. Pay particular attention to number 6, parochial schools. Parochial means, normally it means local in nature, right? Like if something is parochial, it's local. But in this context, it means Catholic church schools. So if you think about like Sacred Heart, for example, here in Danville, these would be the Catholic Church created a lot of private schools for both a Catholic education, but also for a good education. And then Chautauqua actually occurs on the shores of Lake Chautauqua in New York, and then becomes a household idea, the idea of a lecture tour that printed home study courses. But if you go back to the Lyceum lecture circuit, back when like Emerson and others would go around and tell, well, this is the kind of stuff that Susan B. Anthony would still be able to do. Helen Keller would do this. Booker T. Washington, big time on the Chautauqua. So it was a chance to be educated. So, if you think about YouTube, with the YouTube access, you could probably become as educated as a graduate of Harvard. The problem of education is not access for the 21st century student. It's, are you going to watch Yoda videos where he points a stick at Luke Skywalker instead of watching videos on, William James? The problem isn't the availability of knowledge, it's the how, which do you choose to access? Well, back then there wasn't the availability of that much. So you really wanted to see the Chautauqua, if you're an adult who was curious about much of anything. Okay, so definitely be familiar with these innovations or changes. Chautauqua, again, starts in New York, kind of becomes a national tour of neat thinkers, writers, speakers. public lecture series. Okay. Now, I want to turn now to probably the most significant figures in the American civil rights movement until Dr. King. So when you think about the American civil rights movement, for a lot of students, it kind of ends in Reconstruction and doesn't resume until, Brown versus Board or somewhere in the 50s. But that would be a very bad judgment on the student's part. So we need to first focus on Booker T. Washington, who was an extraordinary figure. He's born in Franklin County, right up the road. He was born in Bedford County, in between Franklin, Bedford, and Pennsylvania. The Booker T. Washington birthplace is a national monument right up the road. If you're on the way to Smith Mountain Lake, you can take a quick detour and right up there. It's not a plantation where he was born. It was a farm, but he was born into slavery. He had no last name, so that's the name he chose when he became free. He was extraordinarily gifted as a pragmatist, and we're going to talk about what that means later, but as a practical civil rights advocate. So what Booker T. Washington's core thesis that he makes routinely in his speeches and his writings and as his role as the principal of Tuskegee Institute is that African Americans cannot hope for civil rights, civil equality, until they have economic equality. So let that sink in. They cannot really hope to have civil equality or civil rights until they're treated equally economically. I think he was really onto something here, because he said if we have a skill, if we have talents that we can utilize to become self-sufficient, you hear that? So Booker T. Washington believed that if blacks could become educated in what we would call today the Career and Technical Center education, VOTEC, so vocational skill, if you have a practical employable skill, then you'll be treated very differently than if you don't. And he argued that once blacks achieved economic equality with whites, then political rights would follow. But that the first couldn't lead the second. Like you couldn't just demand it and expect Southern whites to give it. You understand? Booker T. Washington said, he grew up in the South. He knew the South well. He worked with, by the way, his great educational facility, he built by hand with money given to him by Andrew Carnegie. When he arrived in Tuskegee, there was nothing there. So that thing that you see there, they built. The students and the teachers built it, okay, at least initial campus. So he goes to Atlanta and gives a remarkable speech during an Atlanta convention. So it was in 1895, and you need to know this speech. It's called the Atlanta Compromise. Okay, at least that's what his critics called it. That's what Du Bois called it. All right. But what he believed is that if white America ignored the problem of racism or limited the growth of the Negro, they would, and this is such a great line that I fully believe, they would and by the way, this is true for not just black people, but for, I think, poor people in general, like really poor people. He said, and listen carefully, we shall constitute 1/3 of the ignorance and crime of the South, or 1/3 of its intelligence and progress. 1/3 to business and prosperity, or a body of death, stagnating, depressing, retarding every effort to advance. So if we are unemployed and laying around doing nothing, then you're going to see a rise in crime, right? So the number one goal that Washington had was to educate African Americans. Educate. Now, particularly educate them in what? Skills, marketable skills, business skills, agriculture. This is why George Washington Carver, a teacher at Tuskegee, does the how many hundred uses of the peanut, right? Like that's good. That's agricultural engineering. That's the kind of stuff we need in this country, right? So he's saying we need to do this, okay? And then he says, the wisest of my race understand that agitation for equality is folly. You don't know what folly, that's a mistake. That would be, he said, an artificial forcing rather than a constant struggle. You understand? So it's the steady growth of educated, hopefully middle-class blacks, not just a law getting passed tomorrow. Pretty impressive argument. Now, again, he represented an academic approach we would consider to be vocational. particularly at Tuskegee, vocational in nature. However, there were other leaders of his day who rejected that. Okay, this is W.E.B. Du Bois, and he did pronounce it Du Bois, not like the French word Dubois. Du Bois, and I would like you to know both of their works. Washington's work is an autobiography called Up from Slavery. Up from Slavery. Make sure you know that. Du Bois's most significant work, although he wrote dozens, is The Souls of Black Folk, which is not an autobiography. It's a collection of essays. Okay. And Du Bois was an extraordinary academic. He was an intellectual. He went to Harvard and graduated there. So he is Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, doctoral PhD graduate of Harvard. He's the first African American to get a doctorate degree from Harvard. And he was not at all interested in the sort of accommodationist, gradualist approach of Booker T. Washington. He said that that was basically, a sort of way of betraying the rights that they have as Americans. If we have to do this gradually, then where's our rights, as Americans? And so he's going to argue that there needs to be constant legal pressure on institutions that deny rights to Black people. And by doing this, he leads to the foundation of the most influential and important African-American legal arguers, so to speak, legal organization, and that is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It is still the most powerful civil rights advocacy group for African Americans. By the way, he didn't found it alone. He founded it with Jane Addams, remember her, and others. But the reason it was initially called the Niagara Movement is that Blacks weren't allowed to congregate in groups to talk politically in America, in New York, where he was. So he went up to Canada, over Niagara Falls. And that's why it's called the Niagara Movement. He believed that civil rights were owed to African Americans as citizens and that it should be immediate. However, he recognized that that might be too much. And so he did believe that a portion of the African American community, the talented tenth, he called them, should certainly be elevated to social equality immediately. Like, in other words, if there had to be a vanguard, then let's do this, but no more of this delay. Now, again, Du Bois didn't spend any time in the South. He's writing from the perspective of a very well-educated free Black in the North. And so his perspective is very different from Booker T. Washington, as you might imagine. But these two figures are really fundamentally significant people in terms of this period of this debate. So in around the 1880s to the early 1900s, you're going to have an enormous rise in the question on how is equality going to be achieved. And so you have two different points of view. One is economic and gradual. The other is immediate and political. And so that's an important distinction. I would definitely note both of these figures. Moving on, definitely be aware of colleges' growth during this period. So you're going to have a lot more colleges available. Women are going to be able to go to the sister colleges of the Ivy Leagues. They're going to expand many more so-called women's colleges. You're going to have the beginning in what are called the historic Black colleges, HBC. And so starting with schools like Hampton Institute, later Howard University. So you're going to have these historic Black colleges that are going to grow quite a bit. Emory down in Atlanta is one that comes to mind. And then I would remind you that our federal government had begun during Abraham Lincoln to make an effort to promote higher education. So you may recall that the government is selling a lot of land, right? Tons of federal land. And so what they began to do, now they didn't initiate, I always have to give a shout out to my good friend, Mr. Clark Scott. The very first land grant university in America was created in Michigan. And it was Michigan State University, but that was created by the state of Michigan. So Michigan, when they sold land, they built a university. Now, my alma mater, Virginia Tech, Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, is a land grant college. NC State, land grant college, lots of land grant colleges around, and they focus primarily on agriculture and engineering initially. So they were trying to provide a college in rural America for training for rural students primarily. So my good friend, Mr. Jackie Hardy, he went to Tech, and he back in the day in the 50s, early 60s, and got an agricultural engineer degree. You know, so when you think about the best schools in the country for ag, and by that I mean agricultural engineering, for veterinarians, for all that, usually land grant universities, and these are often the sort of pride of many states because they got to build it on their terms, even though it was funded by federal money. Okay, so they got federal dollars to build higher ed colleges, particularly here in our county or in our state. We have through Virginia Tech, we have a cooperative agricultural extension agents, you know, who help farmers make sure the science of their farming is their most efficient, their best. Ohio State, I'm sure you guys have heard of Ohio State, another huge land grant university. So often really big schools too. Okay. I would be remiss to not mention that during this period, and I could probably just add this down, you're going to see several philanthropic, you guys remember what philanthropy means, I hope, philanthropic donations. So you guys remember Duke, Stanford, Vanderbilt, University of Chicago, that's where Rockefeller gave his money. So all of these schools are going to be the recipients, I guess if I mention Tuskegee in the same breath, of big university donations by wealthy people. So you're going to see a lot of rich people donating money and having their name or their kids' names. Well, I'm trying to think of other ones. I think the book mentions Cornell is in there. So these are big universities that are endowed. That's the word we use. I should probably call that endowments instead of donations, since that's what, when you endow something, it means you give them a lot of money and it just keeps making money and it keeps funding it. So like the endowment at Duke is so big, even if Duke didn't take any money in, Duke's endowment would grow every year, you know, because it's like an investment. Okay, so that's a smart idea. The big money. So higher ed begins to really grow, and you can see that with guys like Dr. Du Bois, Dr. Woodrow Wilson. The book mentions is a graduate. Teddy Roosevelt, graduate of Harvard. He was a naturalist trained by Harvard's, you know, natural department. One thing that's interesting for me during this period is a beginning and change of, and I think this is kind of progressive, and a change of how students select classes. Before, when you went to, let's say, William and Mary or the University of Virginia or Harvard, you had a very set curriculum. Like pretty much everybody took it. So it didn't matter if you're a lawyer or a pastor, pretty much everybody had to take Greek and Latin, you know, the classics. That was what you took. And it's what everybody took. So at Harvard, they began to say, well, you know, students can come here and become even better students if they tend to tailor their studies toward a specific focus. And so that leads to the creation of the elective system. So I'm sitting here looking at my son's next 4 years of schooling. I'm like, not a whole lot of room for electives till his senior year, is it? Like AP, environmental science, and psych, maybe. You know, like so. But the idea is that when you have that very rigid curriculum, it doesn't create for much input on the part of the student. Like the student doesn't get to tailor their interest. And one of my goals for y'all, if anything else, is when you get your 60 credits for DCC and get your associates, you'll probably, you know, if you're at UVA, you'll definitely have to go at least 3 years anyway. They don't care if you got associates or not. But you will be able to at least not have to take the classes that everybody has to take. You understand? By knocking out APUSH, then you're done with that. And that means you might be able to take, you know, I don't know, the history of bottling glass or whatever you want, like, or film appreciation. And so the electives allow students to select from what we would call a cafeteria plan. You know, here you have this wide array, and you can pick and choose what to do. Now, obviously, if you go to university, they're going to still have requirements. If you major in engineering at Virginia Tech, you have very, very little wiggle room. You understand? All 4 years, 3 years certainly will be absolutely fed to you in terms of that degree. And if you double major, forget about it. There's no electives. All right, double majoring means you're going to take all core for your 2 majors. But the good news is with all your college credit, you'll be able to have more options for electives. Improvements in medicine. I remind you that medicine, you know, one of the reasons why during this period that folks like Mary Baker Eddy had quite a success was people were afraid of medicine. If you go back to the pre-Civil War and Civil War era medicines, you know, your medicine probably killed you. You know, 9 times out of 10, it was probably safer not to take it. But you had advances by Europeans that were brought over here. For example, Pasteur and the idea of how to get rid of bacteria. Joseph Lister, he's the first to kind of clean medical tools so that they're hygienic repeatedly. So that's going to make life better. Okay, so people are going to live a little bit longer, a little bit healthier, a little bit more middle class. Okay. By the way, I didn't mention here what a philanthropist was again, but I thought that you guys maybe remember that when I give my $500 or so a year, it's a charitable contribution, right? When the Burris family donates $60 million to Virginia Tech, that's philanthropy. You know, it's like super charity. All right, and of course, the biggest of all, I should have mentioned, the most famous of all was Carnegie, right? He's the one that gave away a third of his wealth, at least, just in terms of libraries and colleges. So Carnegie's your big guy during this period. All right, now, this is an issue for me that I consider quite interesting, that American students are usually utterly not interested in, so yay. But this guy, William James, is probably the most significant philosopher in American history. So when you think of philosophers, certainly as an American, when I think of philosophers, 20th century or 19th century philosophers, I think of Nietzsche or Jung or Schopenhauer. You know, I think of not the ancient Greeks, but I think of Europeans. I think of Immanuel Kant or Voltaire. You know, but this guy is going to be a revolutionary figure, both in psychology and in philosophy. So he's brilliant, probably by all accounts a genius. He was a professor at Harvard. He wrote the very first textbook on psychology, the principles of psychology. He created. Now keep in mind, this is pre-Freud. You know, Freud hasn't made his way into America really yet. So when we think about this period in history, we think about Sigmund Freud a lot. But he's still over in Austria. So James is a creator of what we would call behavioral psychology. Okay, he helped found that intellectual understanding of why we behave the way we do, so to speak. All right, and so he was a crucial figure at Harvard in that department. He helped basically create the psychology department there. But what's really fascinating to me about him, for me, is his view of philosophy. And his view of philosophy is that America had developed a philosophy. Now, keep in mind, normally we don't think about Americans as philosophical at all. We just don't think about philosophy. Most students don't, and rarely will, unfortunately, since that's the understanding of meaning. But nonetheless, Americans don't want to understand meaning. That's not what we're here for. Yeah, we're here to make money. So what James is going to teach. Now, he didn't originate it purely, but he kind of created the language of it and the understanding of it, is that with pragmatism. Now, if you've never heard the word pragmatic, it's usually used today as a synonym for practical. Okay? But what he argued is that Americans actually have had or created, many Americans, a philosophy that when determining the value of something, determining the reason for something, we ask ourselves, does it have any value? And if it doesn't, we discard it. So in other words, and I've lived this with high school students my whole career, like, what am I going to need this for? Right? What am I going to use history for? Right? So what James would argue, and the video that I shared on YouTube that is really interesting, is in one of his writings, maybe in pragmatism, he talks about going for a walk and coming back, okay? And when he's coming back on his walk, his friends are standing there looking at a tree. And on the tree is a squirrel. And one of his friends is kind of walking around the tree. And the squirrel's kind of moving. And so the question they're debating is, did the man walk around the squirrel? Because the squirrel was moving while the man was moving. Is he actually walking around the squirrel? So they're debating this. James comes up and says, basically, why? Why are you having this argument? It's stupid. It has no outcome on anything. You understand? But what he's saying is that's the typical American. Now, I would argue today, Americans argue a whole lot of things that are stupid. Like we've gotten a lot away from pragmatic. But he says, as a core philosophy, at least for people who practice this belief, is that when we gauge decisions, we gauge it on its measurable worth. Now, we might not mentally, practically do that. You know, like, okay, is it worth $4 or? But I use a line whenever I ask students, my family, to do things, and I ask them, is the juice worth the squeeze? You hear that? Is the outcome worth the input? For James, that's pragmatism. It's the question of why do we bother, right? And we bother if the juice is worth the squeeze, if you're pragmatic. And so by saying that, he's saying that's not how Europeans operate. Europeans will sit around and talk all day about what's called blue mean to you. You know, and he'd be like, who cares? You know, so I'm a big fan of William James. I like him a whole lot more than his brother. His brother, apparently, it feels like when I read his works, wanted to be an Englishman. The writers of the late 19th century are extraordinarily diverse. My personal favorite, of course, Mark Twain. But you have other writers who are writing books that sound like they should have been written by a British Victorian novelist. You know, I'm like, bleh, which is my least favorite type of literature. But anyway, here you get it. Pragmatism is this distinctively American notion. What difference would it practically make if either or neither were true? Because here's the thing. Who cares if the guy was circling the squirrel or not, right? Like what changes in any way if that's a result? So he would say, if the notion, right here, I'll read it. What difference would it practically make to anyone if this notion, rather than the notion, were true or not? If no practical difference, then the alternative means practically the same thing. You understand? He's saying if there's no difference in outcomes between it existing or not, then why bother? It's literally a linguistic debate. That's all it is. It's a debate over words. It's not a debate over substance. And I hear it's idle. I hear high school students doing it all the time, you know, because it doesn't have any outcome long term. So if you can't show a practical difference, then who cares? All right, so definitely be aware of William James. Pretty cool dude. Let's go over now to newspapers. So, by the way, just in general, the massive amounts of lending libraries that grew. Remember Andrew Carnegie again? They built the Library of Congress during this period. Newspapers are going to become very cheap. They've got new print technology, so literacy is going to skyrocket. You got people going to school. You got readily available print text. You're just setting the stage for a massive period of success for the whole country, right? So that means you have to get people's attention because for the first time, really, more and more people are reading newspapers. So that means they have choices. They can choose to buy the New York Herald or the New York World or the New York American, right? So you want to get their attention. And so you have these two titans of journalism, two historically massive important figures named Pulitzer and Hearst. Now, Hearst is going to ultimately set up shop and stay in California. He's going to own what we call a syndicate, meaning dozens of newspapers. He's going to have the largest ranch in Mexico, multi-millionaire, billionaire in today's money, right? And Hearst, way more than Pulitzer, was a champion of something we call yellow journalism or the yellow press. Yellow journalism is the hallmark of the late 19th century media because it's sensational. Look at this headline. Harry Thaw kills Stanford wife on roof garden, girl slain. So, it's headline. There's a great old saying that comes out of this period in press, and it's, if it bleeds, it leads, meaning the top stories should be the ones that most get your attention. We call this sensationalism. So you're focusing on crime stories. You're focusing on sexual escapade stories. You're focusing on great adventure stories. This is by the way, the guys that send out, how many of you guys have heard of Stanley and Livingstone? No. Henry Morton Stanley was an American explorer who went and found a Scottish missionary named Robert Livingstone in the heart of Africa. But he cabled back his exploits while exploring Africa. People read it, devoured. So this is called yellow journalism. Now, the other figure who was not as sensationalist, I'll downplay it because he actually was quite a credible journalist and publisher, but he's going to play the game, is Joseph Pulitzer. And today he's a Hungarian immigrant. And today we have a prize, multiple prizes for writing named after him, Pulitzer Prize, which he endowed. So Pulitzer and Hearst are part of what's called the Yellow Press. Now, students sometimes ask, well, why is it called the Yellow Press? Why does it get that name? It gets that name because of really what's considered by many people the first comic strip, the first comic character in history. So if you think about like what, I don't know if you guys, when I was a kid growing up, I read the funny papers. You know, that was the part of the newspaper that had comic strips in it. Dagwood, Peanuts, the Snoopies, you know. So during this period, to attract attention to kids particularly, they began publishing a series of comic strips called The Yellow Kid. See him there? And he had a like 40 or 50-year run in comics. The Yellow Kid was a little immigrant street urchin, you know, kid who was totally bald, and he often sold newspapers by having it displayed on a shirt, you know. That would be like the message. And here he's drinking champagne, you know. So it was actually printed yellow, like his dress there, his little overcoat was yellow. And so what would happen is they'd stack these newspapers up when they would send them out to like the newsstands and stuff. And when they got wet or damp, the yellow ink in the cartoon bled into the whole paper, like it ran. And so when you picked up the newspaper, the paper's color was yellow, literally. So it was called the Yellow Press, not because of sensationalism, all right, but because of a comic strip. All right. So nonetheless, this is yellow journalism, the Yellow Press. And what that means is sensational. That means grab you with the big story of violence or destruction or death, anything that's like that. That's interesting. Scandal. And of course, that's going to become a major part of our media ever since. Now, during this period, you're going to have a collection of writers who are not purely fiction writers. So our pure fiction writers are probably not going to be a big emphasis for us. In other words, we're not going to focus a lot on pure fiction, meaning the American lit figures of American history. But these three writers are very fascinating. Now, the first guy should be kind of isolated from the other two. So let me do that first. This guy wrote in Baltimore. He was a writer in Baltimore. His name was E.L. Godkin. And let's see. He wrote New York, I think, at the time. He wrote for lots of different magazines, and he had a really fascinating way of writing, because what he targeted was, rather than get like y'all to read, who cares about y'all, right? He said it's not important to get tens of thousands of readers. It's important to get the right 100 readers to read. You understand? And so one of the magazines he helped create is still in existence, The Nation. The Nation. It's left wing. It's liberal by all accounts. But you know, this was a way of. So if you wanted to get information that was not just from the big newspapers, then this would be your source. This would be like today we would call this investigative journalism. You know, investigative journalism. And that way, the key people in power would read this and be like, you know. So he's got kind of the ear and eye, so to speak, of the major movers and shakers. His other two are far more socialistic. They're writers who see the problems of the United States industrial capitalism, and they're advocating for socialism, including, in the case of Henry George, the type of socialism he's seeing emerge in Europe. Okay, he believes that any sort of profit off the sale of land for more than it was worth. You understand? In other words, basically ripping off the public is how he viewed it. Then you had to pay a 100% land tax on that, which means you lost all the profit on it. But he wants to eliminate his arguments. He wants to eliminate like land and wealth pooling into the hands of a handful of people. So he believes that the best way to do that is kind of split it up and not allow them to keep. He wants a tax on all this excess land that's not being used. Now, of course, that doesn't get passed, right? But there are a lot of people who read this, and it's going to influence them. Okay, Henry George is going to have influence on the socialists of his era, but also the progressives and others who believe that you should tax the rich away from their profits, away from their excess profits. So pre-socialism here. The second, Edward Bellamy, is full-scale socialism. His full-scale socialism, I mean, he writes about a utopian future. Look at the date, 2000, right? He says in the year 2000, he wakes up, and it's perfect. Society's great. Everything's run by the government. Everything's equal. Society's happy. So he is a utopian socialist, but he's a full-scale socialist. So now you're starting to see the idea of the government redistributing wealth to everyone and running the businesses as becoming an attitude. And writers, okay, and political activists. So I would definitely be aware of them, okay? Particularly the Bellamy character. His books are kind of interesting to read because he had something like 1 million followers, and that's hard to imagine. But that's because I think socialism today doesn't bear the heavy. When I watched Senator Sanders campaign as a democratic socialist, it was fascinating because on one side, the right, you had this point of view that it was, this extreme, like early 20th century socialism, redistribution of the wealth schemes. And then on the left, you had a lot of young people like, yeah, this sounds awesome. So it's interesting to me that young people, at least generationally, are very less opposed to the idea of socialism, very much less opposed to it than they once were. So that I can show you data that shows that like 20-somethings, 25 and under. So what's happening is I think where there is a sense that has reemerged in America, reflected by people like Senator Sanders, that redistribution ideas are still very much palatable, very much popular. And so that's on the politically active people. Now, people talk about Joe Biden being a socialist. I'm like, no, and that's what's ironic is that the Dems did not nominate a serious progressive. Now he'll probably pass or have passed a lot of progressive stuff, but not a socialist. Okay, so make sure when you see these terms, these are what socialists we're talking about. All right, and I would argue that that's certainly what Senator Sanders is saying too. Now let's talk about the ladies. We haven't visited them in a while, and this is one of my favorite ladies in history. She is really fascinating. Not the least because she was an advocate for free love, which is pretty cool, I think. Not literally, but kind of crazy. The idea of, keep in mind today, you have a tragic description of, and I don't like this phrase, but there's this concept called slut shaming, which is ugly, right? Not a nice thing to say at all. Well, this woman did not believe that you needed to get married and that you should be able to have sexual partners with who you want. And that's in the 1870s. Now, I remember when Hillary Clinton ran for president a couple of years ago, people are like, oh, yeah, the first woman candidate for president. Yeah, it's a big deal, right? First African-American vice president. Yeah, it'd be cool, or whatever. And so I was like, yeah, what about Victoria Woodhull? She ran for president in 1872. Women couldn't even vote in 1872, and she ran for president. Frederick Douglass was her running mate. It's kind of interesting. She ran as a candidate of the Equal Rights Party, and she was very interesting because she was a full equality advocate, meaning she believed that men and women should not be treated differently. She ran a stock brokerage firm on Wall Street, her and her sister. She was known for having parties with, groups of people. And she was very much comfortable in a free love, doing it business with men, trading stocks with men, and really being, I guess you would say, like a shock to the system. She was like way ahead of her time. But I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the fact that she was so avant-garde, and she was very, very criticized at the time. Trust me, people attacked her as being promiscuous and as being not a woman and stuff like that. Here you see Thomas Nast poking fun at her and her free love. They call them bewitching brokers. They're women. And then here you see Nast depicting her as a succubus, a demon. So not very nice kind of perspectives on this woman. But her and her sister really were able to break through to the zeitgeist, I guess is the way to put it, to make people aware of it. And the fact that she ran for president was quite notable. Okay, so that was Victoria Woodhull, certainly not your typical lady there. Now, it's important to not forget that Susan B. Anthony is still alive. You know, people are, Susan B. Anthony, hasn't she been around since like 1812 or something? Not quite that long, but definitely since the Seneca Falls Convention, although she wasn't there, but 1840s. So here's a depiction of her having a tea party, so to speak. You can see another woman with a man's face on her mask there. Here you see her running the ship. And so the funny thing is Nast, you guys remember Nast, the guy who was a cartoonist? He was routinely anti-feminine and anti-feminist in his publications. But his publisher was a supporter of women's rights. So it's very fascinating to me that these women were still active. And here's what Susan B. Anthony went to jail for voting. She voted in 1872, or tried to. And she got arrested. You know, so before, you know, when we think about voting, before the Civil War, this was not something most women were really actively campaigning for, the right to vote. But after the Civil War, particularly after the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, women are full-scale advocating for the right to vote, right? And so here you read her writing, I stand before you under indictment for a crime of having voted without having the right to vote. It shall be my work to prove you this is thus voting. I not only committed no crime, but exercised my right as a citizen. All right, so she's arguing, look, I have the right under the Constitution. Aren't women persons under the 14th Amendment? And I hardly believe any of our opponents will have the hardihood to say they're not persons. Being persons, then, they're citizens. Women are citizens, right? That's the 14th Amendment. No state should make any law to prohibit them. So there will be progress in the area of women's rights during this period, particularly if you go out west. You're going to actually see the first state guaranteeing the right to vote. But before we get to that, I want to make a mention of one last woman today, and then we'll have to call it a day. Actually, I'll save her. Let's talk about, for a moment, Anthony Comstock. I forgot to mention him. And he's an important guy, particularly because he's sort of like a counterpoint to the role of Victoria Woodhull. So Anthony Comstock, and he's an interesting dude, to say the least. Comstock was a moral crusader. Okay, he was a moral crusader. And so if you go back in history, you may recall we had talked about Neil Dow, right, the father of prohibition. But Anthony Comstock was another one of these guys who really wanted to reform society on Christian grounds as a Christian. And so, like I said, you know, again, I'm not a fan of calling people names or anything like that. But what Comstock said is that there is stuff like this circulating throughout our country, and it is degrading the moral sort of fiber of our country. And so by stuff, I mean like what they would have considered pornography, right? Drugs. So if you start to think about, if you think about like 20th century and 21st century, if you think about Christian reformers, frequently you think about them as campaigning against things like pornography and drugs, right? And so that is what this fella is so historic for, is leading a sort of moral crusade. Part of that same group that the Third Great Awakening were sort of in, though, and they really wanted to eliminate vice. So we would call a lot of this stuff vice, meaning particularly, if you'll notice, things like prostitution, the selling of drugs. So this is the first time in American history, I think, where there was a large-scale outcry against the use of opiates, the use of drugs that were highly addictive during this period. So you're going to see Comstock have an influence, particularly on state and local laws. Not as big on federal laws. Sorry, that was way bigger than I think. But so be familiar with Comstock laws, which I'm reading from the text here, which was immoral things like he confiscated 200,000 obscene pictures, 4,000 boxes of pills used by abortionists, 26 obscene pictures that were on saloon walls. So, you know, what you're starting to see here between Woodhull and Comstock is clearly America is no longer the kind of cultural society that our founders maybe would have recognized, right? So, you know, this was the period of, it's not the 1920s, okay? But the gay 90s, as they're called, this is called the gay 90s, meaning gay happy, were in many ways reflective of the 1920s, reflective of the 1950s, reflective of the 1980s, reflective of the 2010s, you know, 2010s. So this is where we are. You know, this kind of wheel keeps on turning, and it's interesting to me that, you know, I don't know if y'all are watching this and thinking, well, gee, I've heard debates between fundamentalists and modernists, or I've heard, you know, debates about should we legalize abortion or drugs or things like that, right? Well, these debates didn't start, you know, recently. They've been going on for quite a long time, particularly as we became more urban and more affluent. I would make that point too. So we'll talk about women's rights tomorrow. Continue one of my favorite women's rights activists, Helen Keller, and we'll call it a good finished presentation.